In the hushed tension of a federal courtroom, Jasmine Crockett, a bold, unyielding attorney, steps and confronts the unthinkable, a powerful judge who mocks her before the entire room. With unwavering poise, she exposes hidden corruption lurking behind the gavel. Each dismissive glare from the bench fans the flames of her defiance. Rumors swirl, jaws drop, and cameras roll as Jasmine stands her ground. Just when it seems the system will crush her, evidence emerges that will shake the pillars of justice itself. The question is, how far will she go to reveal the truth? If you're hooked, make sure you subscribe, because tomorrow we have another story that will blow your mind. On a cold and chilly morning at the federal courthouse in the Western District, the air seemed heavier than usual. It was as if even the bricks of the courthouse could sense that something significant was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett, a determined black attorney, stepped into the courtroom with a case that weighed heavily on her shoulders. In her hands, she held a thick stack of files, stamped in bold red with the words "State versus Loss and Misappropriation of Public Funds." This wasn't the first time Jasmine had faced dangerous criminals or complex cases, but today felt different, not because of the seriousness of the case, but because of the man sitting at the bench, Judge Victor Blackwell. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air as soon as she entered the courtroom. Every step she took echoed loudly against the cold, hard granite floor, almost as though it was a reminder of the challenges ahead. She straightened her collar, took a deep breath, and walked forward. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, her eyes immediately met the cold, calculating gaze of Judge Victor Blackwell. It wasn't a glance of acknowledgement, nor was it a simple, professional nod. No, this was a look that measured her, sized her up like an insignificant item on a clearance shelf. It was as if he was silently asking, "What are you doing here?" without saying a word. There were no formalities, no gestures of respect. Only a sneer, a subtle but clear signal of dismissal. In that moment, Jasmine felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest. It wasn't fear that tightened her throat. It was the chilling realization that she wasn't just stepping into a courtroom today. She was stepping into a fortress of power, one that had been built long before her arrival. This wasn't a room where justice was blind. It was a room where the powerful chose who would be heard and who would be silenced. As Jasmine stood there, facing Judge Victor Blackwell, the weight of the situation pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as if he were dissecting her with a single glance. His smug, superior expression never wavered as he observed her, evaluating every step she took, every move she made. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in with an invisible, suffocating pressure. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about presenting evidence. It wasn't about proving her case. This was about a battle of power, a clash between truth and the corrupt system that had protected men like Blackwell for far too long. The silence in the room was deafening. Every person present in the courtroom, from the stenographer to the defense attorney, seemed to be waiting with bated breath, anticipating what would happen next. Jasmine could feel the cold, judgmental stares of everyone around her, and yet it wasn't the spectators she feared. It was Blackwell, the man who held the power to decide the fate of not just her case, but her career. His position, his reputation, and his arrogance made him untouchable in the eyes of so many. And yet, here she was, about to take on the full force of his contempt. "Miss Crockett," Blackwell's voice broke the silence, smooth and mocking. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden desk, as if he had all the time in the world. "I trust you won't be wasting my time with irrelevant details. Let's keep this brief, shall we?" The words were like daggers, aimed straight at her, and though she felt them, Jasmine didn't flinch. She had been here before, facing powerful men who believed they could control the course of justice simply because they had the right titles, the right connections, and the right amount of money. But she was different. She wasn't intimidated by power, nor would she be silenced by it. Today, she would make sure that the truth had a voice, no matter how much Blackwell and his allies tried to bury it. She stood tall, her posture unwavering, even as Blackwell's eyes bored into her. She could feel the weight of every person in that room watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. But there was no room for mistakes here. There was no room for hesitation. The stakes were too high, and she wasn't about to let this man or this system crush her. Jasmine had come too far to back down now. As she opened a case file, revealing the stack of evidence she had carefully prepared, Jasmine felt a surge of adrenaline course through her veins. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She had done the research, collected the documents, and pieced together the story of corruption that had been hidden behind the gilded walls of privilege and power. Now, it was time to lay it all out for the world to see. "I have evidence," she began, her voice steady but firm, "that shows Charles Lawson, the defendant, used his position and influence to misappropriate millions of taxpayer dollars. These funds were funneled into a shell company owned by him, bypassing the law and circumventing the proper channels. The documents in front of me detail wire transfers, budget sheets, and investment fund reconciliations, all of which point to a pattern of deliberate fraud." Blackwell's expression didn't change. His eyes remained cold and calculating, as if he were hearing a tedious lecture from a student who had nothing new to offer. He barely looked at the evidence she presented, his disinterest apparent. "Figures, figures, figures," he muttered, clearly dismissing her argument without a second thought. "I don't have time for your boring numbers, Miss Crockett. This is a courtroom, not a financial seminar." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, quiet and venomous. Jasmine's blood boiled, but she didn't react. She couldn't afford to. She had trained herself for moments like this, when the odds were stacked against her, when the system seemed so rigged that it felt impossible to break through. But she had learned something valuable in her years as an attorney. When people try to silence you, that's when your voice needs to be the loudest. And today, her voice would be heard. She looked directly at Blackwell, unflinching. "Your Honor," she continued, her tone unwavering, "this evidence was gathered by 3 independent financial agencies. It has been certified and verified. The figures you're dismissing are not just numbers. They are the key to uncovering a scheme that has been hiding in plain sight." For a moment, there was silence. Blackwell stared at her, his face expressionless. Jasmine could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps irritation, perhaps anger. He was used to being in control, to having the power to dictate the proceedings. But now, she could sense that something was shifting, something he didn't quite know how to handle. For the first time, she could see a crack in his armor. But instead of acknowledging it, Blackwell leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I see. You're going to stand here and waste my time with this. All because you believe some numbers printed on a piece of paper will somehow change the reality of the situation?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor, then glanced at the defense attorney, who gave a slight nod in agreement. "Miss Crockett, I strongly advise you to tone down these emotional theatrics. This is a courtroom, not a stage for dramatic performances." The room fell silent again, the words hanging in the air. Jasmine could feel the weight of their disdain, but she wouldn't allow it to shake her. She had a job to do, and she wouldn't let anyone, not even Judge Blackwell, stop her from doing it. Her hands gripped the file tighter, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I am not here to perform for you," she said, her words clear and precise. "I am here to ensure that the truth is heard. And the truth is, there has been a theft. There has been corruption. And it is time for this system to finally be held accountable." As the words left her lips, Jasmine felt a shift in the room. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was there. For the first time, people were beginning to listen, not to her gender, not to her race, but to the evidence she was presenting. They were beginning to see that this wasn't just about a corrupt defendant or a biased judge. It was about the very foundation of the legal system itself, and how far it would go to protect its own. And Jasmine was ready to tear it all down. Jasmine stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her chest. The courtroom was electric with tension, the silence so thick that it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. The camera lenses, once focused on her opponent, now trained their gaze on her as well. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, felt amplified, as if the entire world was watching, waiting for her to either falter or triumph. Across from her, Judge Blackwell sat, his eyes cold and calculating, barely acknowledging her presence as he flipped through his notes. His earlier mockery of her, the condescending remarks, the dismissive glances, they had all been a prelude to what Jasmine knew was coming next. He had already made it clear that he thought she was nothing more than a nuisance, someone who didn't belong in this space. But Jasmine wasn't going to back down. Not today. Not in the face of everything that was at stake. She glanced briefly at the defense table, where Charles Lawson sat with his attorney, appearing completely unfazed. Lawson, with his wealth and influence, had spent his life manipulating the system. He was used to getting away with it. He had surrounded himself with a fortress of power, and today, Jasmine was determined to tear it down. Her fingers tightened around the stack of papers in front of her as she began to present her evidence. "Your Honor, I am here today with the truth," Jasmine began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of 1,000 unsung stories. "These documents prove that Charles Lawson, the defendant, used his position and influence to siphon millions of dollars from the public coffers into his own private accounts. These weren't just minor misallocations. They were deliberate, calculated thefts of public funds." Jasmine placed the first set of documents on the table, facing the judge and jury. They were budget sheets, wire transfer records, and investment fund reconciliations. Each one detailed a series of transactions, discrepancies that couldn't be explained away by simple error. The numbers didn't lie. The truth was right there, staring them all in the face. But Judge Blackwell, ever the embodiment of arrogance, barely looked up. His gaze flicked lazily at the documents, a hint of boredom in his eyes. He didn't even pretend to study the evidence. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the desk, as if he had all the time in the world. His nonchalant attitude only served to fuel the fire inside Jasmine. She wasn't just fighting for justice in this case. She was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed or belittled because they dared to challenge the status quo. "I don't have time for your boring numbers," Blackwell said flatly, dismissing her evidence with a wave of his hand. "I hope you're not planning on turning this into a circus, Miss Crockett." The word stung, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard worse before, faced far more than condescension in her career. But this was different. This was personal. This man, this judge, didn't just represent the legal system. He represented everything that was wrong with it. He was the face of corruption, the face of those who thought they could get away with anything, simply because they had the power to do so. She paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with quiet determination, she looked him directly in the eye. "Your Honor, I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to expose the truth. And the truth is, millions of taxpayer dollars have been stolen, laundered, and funneled into Lawson's private accounts. The public has been defrauded. You cannot dismiss that." The room seemed to hold its breath as the words hung in the air. The defense attorney, sensing the shift, exchanged a glance with Judge Blackwell, but Jasmine didn't give them the chance to dismiss her again. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. She continued, more forcefully this time. "This is not just a case of embezzlement. This is a case of betrayal. The people who rely on these funds, teachers, healthcare workers, families in need, have been denied what rightfully belongs to them. Charles Lawson isn't just a criminal. He is a symbol of a system that has failed those it was meant to protect. And that, Your Honor, is something we cannot ignore." The room was silent now. Even Blackwell's usual air of superiority seemed to waver. For the first time, he looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing at her. But Jasmine didn't look away. She was ready to face him, ready to face the system, ready to expose the truth that had been hidden for so long. The defense lawyer cleared his throat, but Jasmine could tell he was unsure. He had been confident earlier, smug even, but now there was a hint of uncertainty creeping into his demeanor. The balance of power was shifting. Jasmine could feel it in the air. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about bringing down the walls of a corrupt system, piece by piece. As the stenographer's keys clicked away, Jasmine stood her ground. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in this courtroom, the truth had a voice. And that voice wasn't going to be silenced. Not by Blackwell, not by anyone. The tension in the courtroom was now unbearable, thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jasmine stood firm at the podium, her every word a direct challenge to the powerful man sitting on the bench. Judge Blackwell had spent years ruling over others, wielding his authority like a weapon to oppress those beneath him. But today, his empire of arrogance and impunity was beginning to crack. As the recording of his voice filled the courtroom, the walls that had shielded him from accountability began to crumble. There was no denying it. The voice on that recording was unmistakable. Judge Blackwell, instructing someone to suppress the evidence that Jasmine had meticulously gathered. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was proof of his deliberate and calculated actions to obstruct justice, to protect the guilty, and to ensure that the powerful remained untouchable. Jasmine stood tall, her resolve unshaken. The room, once filled with a sense of hierarchy and power, now felt different. The energy had shifted. It was no longer the judge who controlled the room, but Jasmine, the one who had brought the truth to light. She faced Blackwell without hesitation. "Your Honor," she began, her voice strong and unwavering. "You can no longer deny your involvement. The evidence is clear. You have abused your power, and today, it ends." Blackwell's face, once so confident and composed, was now a mask of fury. His jaw clenched as his eyes darted from the evidence to the faces of a jury. The power he once held seemed to be slipping away, and he was desperate to cling to whatever control he had left. He slammed his gavel onto the desk with unnecessary force, tried to maintain his authority. "This is an outrage," he spat. "I will not allow this nonsense to continue." But Jasmine wasn't fazed. She knew the moment had come, the pivotal point where everything was about to change. "You have no right to silence the truth," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "You may sit on that bench, but you are not above the law." Her words resonated like a thunderclap, and she could feel the weight of them sinking into the room. There were no longer any pretenses of fairness. The truth had been exposed, and Judge Blackwell's attempts to dismiss it were no longer credible. The audience room, once spectators, were now witnesses to the downfall of a man who believed he was untouchable. The defense attorney, who had been so smug just moments before, shifted uneasily in his seat. The room was no longer the place he thought it was. There were no more games to be played. Jasmine had stripped the layers of pretense away, and the truth was now fully exposed for everyone to see. Judge Blackwell, his face now drained of color, tried once more to regain control. He turned to the jury, attempting to redirect the focus, but the damage had been done. The jury had seen the evidence. They had heard the recording, and they could no longer ignore the corruption staring them in the face. Before he could speak again, the door to the courtroom swung open, and 2 federal officers stepped inside. The silence was absolute. The air was thick with the tension of a moment that felt as though it had been building for years. "Judge Blackwell," one of the officers said, his voice firm and unwavering, "by order of the United States Attorney General, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and aiding in the embezzlement of public funds." The room was stunned into silence. Jasmine watched as Blackwell, once a man who had lorded over others with an air of invincibility, was now helpless, his arrogance crumbling in the face of the law. As the officers moved toward him, she felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered with the knowledge that the battle was far from over. This victory, while significant, was only one step in a much longer journey. Jasmine had torn down one pillar of corruption, but the entire system needed to be rebuilt, and Jasmine would be there, leading the charge, ensuring that every stone was overturned. Today was only the beginning. As Jasmine Crockett walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the day began to settle on her shoulders. It wasn't the kind of victory that made you want to celebrate. It was a quiet, resolute victory, born from the knowledge that the truth had been spoken and the corrupt had been held accountable. Judge Blackwell's arrest, the conviction of Charles Lawson, these were monumental steps, but they were just that, steps. The system was still flawed, the battle still raging, but today, the scales of justice had tipped in favor of the people. Jasmine paused for a moment, allowing herself to take in the gravity of what had just occurred. She felt the eyes of those around her, the reporters, the onlookers, the supporters who had followed the case, pushing into her consciousness. They had witnessed the exposure of a corrupt judge, the fall of the man who believed he was untouchable. And now, as they watched Jasmine walk away, they understood that one person could change everything. The power of truth, wielded with courage and determination, had brought down a fortress of corruption. Yet, there was no celebration in Jasmine's heart. She had known that exposing Blackwell's actions wouldn't fix everything. It wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about breaking a system that had allowed figures like him to thrive in the first place. Blackwell was only the tip of the iceberg. Jasmine knew that her fight was just beginning. She had fought against Blackwell's arrogance and manipulation in this courtroom, but the larger battle would be fought in the halls of power, in every institution that had failed the people for so long. There were countless other corrupt officials, countless other systems in need of reform. Jasmine had exposed the first crack in the wall, but there were many more to come. As she stepped into the cool evening air, Jasmine didn't feel the weight of victory, but the weight of responsibility. The fight for justice wasn't just about winning one case. It was about changing a narrative, challenging the very foundations of a system that had long been built on the oppression of the vulnerable and the unchecked power of the privileged. Jasmine's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the messages from friends and colleagues. But none of them could capture the feeling inside her. This wasn't a moment for congratulatory messages. It was a moment for reflection, for understanding that this small victory was only the beginning of something much larger. She knew that with every step she took forward, there would be resistance. But Jasmine was ready. The struggle for justice would not be an easy one, but as she had learned today, truth could never be buried forever. The system would fight back, but so would she, and the waves of justice, she realized, were just beginning to build. Today had been the start. Tomorrow, and every day after that, Jasmine would keep fighting, not just for people she represented, but for every person who had ever been crushed by a system that wasn't built for them. The truth had set the stage for change, and Jasmine would make sure it would never be silenced again. As Jasmine Crockett descended the steps of the courthouse, the cool afternoon breeze seemed to whisper to her, carrying with it a sense of quiet triumph. Today, the story of justice had been written in the most powerful way. Judge Blackwell had been exposed and Lawson convicted. The story that had been unfolding for so long, one of corruption, manipulation, and silence, had come to a halt. But Jasmine knew this victory was just a beginning. The waves of justice were only starting to spread, and the unraveling of fates had just begun. She had become part of a larger narrative, one where stories of justice would no longer be hidden away, where heartwarming stories of truth overcoming oppression would be shared and told. Jasmine, a black woman in a system designed to silence her, had fought against the odds and stood tall, proving that even the most powerful could be brought to account. She had created a ripple in the waters of injustice, one that would reverberate far beyond this courtroom. As she walked away from the courthouse, Jasmine knew that her fight wasn't just about this one case, or even about one judge. She had become a beacon for something much greater, a movement of voices rising against a system that had long been stacked in favor of the privileged. Narrated stories of those who had been forgotten, of the powerless who had suffered in silence, would now have a place in the world. The tides had shifted. Jasmine's role in these stories wasn't over. She was part of a new era, where every struggle for justice was a story worth telling. Her story was one of unwavering courage, of a black woman who stood tall and made waves, unraveling the fates of those who thought they were untouchable. And with each step she took, she was making sure that justice would not be a fleeting story but an enduring legacy.